All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? This is, I believe, the second episode that we've covered in 2026 already, or the second recorded episode of 2026. And I think it would be good for us, Brian, to talk about the comic landscape of 2026. Of course, we love Joe Rogan.
Ooh.
We love Shane Gillis. Bert Kreischer, fantastic fucking comedian. But you know what, Brian? I was thinking that we could cover Kill Tony specifically, because you told me you wanted to talk about comics this episode. Is that correct, Brian?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really think Kill Tony, he got a bad rap at that RMC thing. I don't really know what it was all about. Just know the guy got a job. He went up there. He did a tight five, a really good set, and everyone got mad at him. And I don't understand why.
No, I don't fucking get it either. Unproblematic king, Kill Tony Hinchcliffe. Absolutely. And fucking the screaming homeless guy, whatever the fuck his name is, Tom Segura, all the classic fucking Kill Tony guys.
So we're giving up the ghost here a little bit because I literally don't know who these names are at this point, because that is not the type of comics that I know about.
Oh, when you said comics, Brian, I thought we were talking about the current comedy landscape in Austin, Texas. Are you talking about the printed comics?
We are talking about the floppy, bi-weekly to monthly periodicals that for many decades could be found on newsstands at one point in small independent retailers by the thousands, or at some points millions, throughout our great nation. I would argue one of the few great American art forms that nobody talks about anymore, that nobody knows any characters from anymore, the comic book.
Well, Brian, real quick though, that also describes Tony Hinchcliffe, because he is just the biggest sensation of America. He's floppy and he's also bi-weekly. In fact, he's bisexual at least weekly.
He's weekly bi.
But yes, without further ado, with our terrible intro out of the way, we're going to be talking about 90s comics. Now, Brian, real quick, you did not want to do a cringe generational segment because honestly, Brian, I would argue that this whole era of the 90s comics bust and boom was just pretty cringy by itself. Would you agree with that?
Well, here's the thing. That is not incorrect. It's a rough time for the industry, both business-wise, which is the main focus of this episode, and story-wise. It's not as bad. That's an oversimplification to say it's all bad. Of course, that's always an oversimplification. What's really cringy is the business practices and how that in turn negatively affected the story choices that were made. But the main reason, though, that I didn't want to do like a cringe generational segment is because the story of the comics boom and bust, the bubble cycle of the 90s comic book industry, that leads to basically the predicament that the comic book industry is in today, both directly and indirectly. And that is kind of my cringe generational segment. Now, to get this out of the way, I began collecting comic books in the very late 90s, very early 2000s. So like right before the movie explosion, so I was probably one of the last batch and one of the last kind of crop of kids that got into comics that got into them without the movies, right? Without like Spider-Man and the X-Men and all that shit. And I was coming in, I didn't realize it at the time, coming into comic books as a serious reader and collector, age 7 or 8, as the dust of all of this crazy bullshit was starting to settle. And of course, coming in and just a few years later, all the movie things would start picking up. One of the things that you notice is that I think publishers expected when these movies came out, especially like the Avengers movies, Iron Man, Captain America, movies that made household names out of somewhat less famous, but still pretty iconic characters. There's no reason to think this wouldn't make the primary industry, the comic books, explode with newfound popularity. I mean, logically, there really is no reason that shouldn't have happened. And unfortunately, it did not. For about the last 10 years, comic books, they've been stable as an industry, but they're not doing great. They're in this weird predicament where the characters are super famous. Every kid in America knows Spider-Man, knows Captain America. They're beloved by people who probably have never stepped foot in the comic book store. And I'm not trying to be like, they're not real comic book, do that stupid nerd shit. I don't care. I like that more kids are seeing Spider-Man stories. I think it's fun or whatever. I'm also not into the MCU movies. I like comic books. I like the art form of the comic book. I don't necessarily like the movies, but I don't begrudge them existing as like a comic book fan or whatever. Part of that's because I haven't actively read new comic books in probably about 15 years also, to be clear. But I go to, local comic book stores pretty frequently still. One of the things you'll see is the industry is now kept afloat, and has been for a long time, by direct market comic book stores. And there's no outside. Where else do you see comic books? They don't sell them at grocery stores anymore. Do you see comic books at newsstands next to magazines at the supermarket? Do you ever see that?
You don't even see them at Barnes and Noble, to be honest with you.
You don't really see single issue comic books at Barnes and Noble even. So you're in this weird place where the only place you can get comic books is the direct retailer. And those direct retailers, like all brick and mortar retail, are in a rough spot. And unlike any other industry, there's no real way for them to branch out or to pivot away from that. But this all goes back. Even like the birth of the MCU, the film franchise, and its massive success that it went through can be traced back to this comic book cycle, where in the early 90s, comic became a massive industry, as big as they ever have been or ever will be commercially, if not creatively. We've never really done a comic book centric episode. We did our American Splendor review. I think we've done some superhero stuff where we, film reviews where we touched on comic books, but we never did a generational kind of post-mortem on anything about comic books. And I thought if we're looking at millennial cringe, would be comic book cringe in the 90s. And not even really cringe. It's more like, it's kind of a tragedy.
Well, real quick though, Brian, because I want to go over just a little bit of my history with comics before you get into it. So I don't really have much of a history with comics, if I'm being honest with you, but I do remember the comic book industry in the very, very, very late 90s and early 2000s, because that was, obviously it was well past the, comic valuation boom, as I recently learned as of like an hour before we recorded this episode, little crash course videos that you sent me. But like, I still remember it from even seeing kids on the playground having like physical comics and stuff like that and talking about it and being really excited about it or whatever. But like, I never really got into comic books because like, just gonna put this out there, I didn't grow up very rich or very like well off or whatever. So like, if we did have like comics or written anything, it was like secondhand. It wasn't anything you could even like spend $5 on. It was something you would get for like 50 cents in a thing or whatever. And we didn't have a comic book store nearby. We had one that did exist, but it went out of business like probably frankly around the time of this bus cycle, to be honest with you. But like, I just don't remember ever really seeing comic books in like wide circulation at the places that my mom would take me to when we'd go shopping or whatever. So like, for me, this is very interesting to learn about, because like I said, I had very little idea about the boom and bust cycle of the comic book valuation, because I always thought that like retro comics were always fairly valuable just from like the media depictions of people talking about them and like, comic book guys.
A lot of people were under that impression.
So I guess I'm learning something new, because like, yeah, like I said, it was definitely one of those things where like, I thought that if you had, fucking 1994 issue of Spider-Man versus Venom or whatever, that was automatically worth something, even in shitty condition. I was just assuming that.
Well, that's the impression a lot of people were in. And I kind of want to give a crash course on why that happened and the effects of it on the industry, to kind of roll back and start with that. Well, also, by the time we were growing up, Taylor, kids already weren't into comic books the way that they were in even like the 70s or the 80s, right? With every generation, the market became more refined. That goes back to the transition from newsstands to the direct market, the invention of the comic book shop. And we're not going to go all the way through all these generations, but this part of our story that is important, it begins in 1970. So prior to then, comic books were sold pretty much exclusively on newsstands and in like magazine stores and cigar stores and, just places that sold newspapers and magazines. They were distributed by the same distributors who had agreements with comic book companies from the 30s through the 60s. And this caused a lot of problems. This caused a lot of tension between publishers and distributors, because there's no clean way to judge how much of a given comic book or a given issue sells. There's lots of disputing between the distributors and the publishers about how much is selling or how much they need. Another thing that caused a lot of tension is that comic book publishers would accept returns of unsold comics from newsstands and retail stores. When I say retail stores, I mean like pharmacies and grocery stores. This created a problem because a retailer could, instead of returning their unsold comic books, just hold on to them. Like hold on to them and then sell them later at a markdown unofficially, right? And this is behind the scenes becoming an issue, kind of a big issue in the 1960s in comic books. In 1970, a few of the first guys, and I don't mean companies, I just mean guys who were serious collectors before that was really a thing. Some of the first big comic book collectors, they reach out to all the major comic book companies at the time. So Marvel, DC, Harvey, Atlas, whoever, and they say, hey, all these guys kind of in concert, but individually say, hey, we have this idea. What if you sell us all of your comic books at a very steep discount from what you're giving them to pharmacies and newsstands and all those retailers? You give them to us in bulk for way cheaper. The catch is we cannot return them to you for a refund. And these are guys who already have these huge decades-long collections of comic books, and they start the first dedicated comic book hobby stores. stores. So throughout the 70s and into the 80s, this direct market starts to exist. It's getting bigger and bigger throughout the 70s and 80s. Throughout the 70s, it's still primarily newsstands and grocery stores. And that's, by the way, that's what makes the comic book a piece of Americana, right? Is that kids in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s are picking up Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four or Superman when their dad picks up the newspaper, or mom and dad are picking it up for them when they're picking up their magazines, and they just see it all the time. You constantly have this influx of new, very young readers, in part because of this newsstand presence. And gradually through the 70s and 80s, that newsstand presence gets diminished and replaced with that direct market. Now, the payoff of the direct market is you now have this whole store. The people that are coming in to buy the comic books are more dedicated, right? They're going to trend older, not adults, not all adults. There's still kids that are into comic books that are going into the comic book store, still preteens and teens going in, but they're more into it. So they're looking to spend more money. They're probably going to buy more comic books at a time. They're going to keep coming back over and over again. They're not going to buy an occasional issue of Superman or Spider-Man. So it's a pretty good business venture on all sides. By the mid 80s, those comic book stores are already the vast majority of comic book sellers. By the mid 80s, you're already not really seeing comic books in the same way in newsstands, grocery stores, pharmacies. And it's not really hurting the industry at this point, but you're seeing a growth in it. The market has now shifted in its presence. In part, its audience, because of these retail stores, you can now have a bigger variety of comic books, right? So you can have like a Robert Crumb comic book next to a Superman comic book. And these two very different types of comic books are being discovered by the same person who in the past only would have bought one of them, right? It's a pretty natural development. It works out. It's pretty positive at this point. But we're going to come back to this because this transition entirely to direct market retail comic book stores, it's kind of a blessing and a curse. And it's a blessing and a curse the industry is still saddled with today. So by the mid-late 80s, you start seeing comic books sell these very high numbers. Probably the highest that they had sold since the early 60s, the Silver Age, kind of Marvel Age. And that's because you have this new crop of artists, right? These guys, primarily in Marvel, who are drawing Spider-Man and X-Men and like Hulk and shit. They're good artists for the most part, and they're a little bit edgy, is what we'd call them today. They're not crazy, but they draw more detail than most of the previous mainstream comic book artists. They draw these scary monsters. They might draw a little bit more blood and guts in the fights. Again, nothing crazy. This is Marvel and DC, but it's different, right? And it's exciting to kids, and it's especially exciting to maybe later teenagers who have been reading for about 10 years and have aged up with the characters, right? So we've got Todd McFarlane drawing Spider-Man, Jim Lee drawing X-Men, Rob Liefeld is doing like X-Force and creates Deadpool, who we talked about in a recent episode. And these are selling crazy numbers. They're getting more and more popular. And all of these guys, so they're all pretty good artists. Like, just for an example, Todd McFarlane, one of my favorite Spider-Man artists ever. I say artists. He is a great artist. A lot of these writers say, well, we're the draw. We're the ones that they're buying it. They love our cool covers. They love the monsters we're drawing. We're the stars. And they pressure Marvel first into giving them their own titles where they can write and draw. So by like 1990, 1991, all three of those guys, Liefeld, Lee, McFarlane, are given their own titles by Marvel. And they sell into the millions, multi-millions. Todd McFarlane gets his own Spider-Man title that he gets to write. It's one of the highest selling comics of all time. Jim Lee illustrates X-Men #1. It's still the highest selling comic book of all time. And it will be forever because the industry will never be in a place to replicate that. These stories are, for the most part, not very good. I'm going to be honest, because these image guys, they can draw. And when someone else is writing for them, you get some very exciting superhero stories. When Todd McFarlane is writing Spider-Man, it's just an excuse for him to draw monsters and draw lots of blurry lines and, lots of cross-hatching. He can't really write, in my opinion. But the comics keep selling. These crop of kind of bad boy younger artists with this edgier style, they start getting a little argumentative with Marvel. And they say, well, we want to own these characters. If Todd McFarlane creates a character for Spider-Man, he feels like he should own it. That's not how Marvel Comics works. And they know that. They're saying, we need to make more money. We deserve this and that. To be clear, the comic book industry has always been very exploitative to artists. I don't want to say they're wrong for that. They were seeing probably the whole history of what had happened before them and trying to determine that it wouldn't happen to them, right? So it's not that they were doing anything wrong. All of these guys form a union, not a union like a labor union, like they unite. And they say, we're going to start our own comic book company. We're going to leave the major. We're going to leave Marvel. And we're going to have a company that only publishes creator-owned content, or like characters. So even though it'll be published under this banner, we own our own characters, whatever we create. That company is Image. Image goes crazy commercially. Starts with McFarlane's Spawn series, Young Liefeld's Youngblood, Eric Larson's Savage Dragon are like the flagship image. They all sell to the multi-millions based on this crazy cool art, and they're these new exciting characters. These guys are basically bringing their fan bases that they built on Spider-Man, on X-Force, on X-Men to these new original characters. And these new original characters are pretty edgy. They are like edgy, fucked up, violent superheroes that do sex stuff, which at the time is really exciting to a lot of these kids reading comics because they're kind of sick of Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, you know? The other thing with Image is that it's underground, right? It's independent, it's creator owned, but it's not like a Robert Crumb comic. It's not like Harvey Pekar or like Cerebus by Dave Sims, which are these previously existed alternative, very literary, satirical comic books. This is superhero stuff that can compete with the X-Men or Superman, but it's also independent. And it becomes this like third way of comic book publishing, right? And it kind of blows the market open. And that causes the whole industry in a lot of different ways tries to meet Image. All of a sudden, Marvel is saying, we got to be as edgy as Image. And they're trying now. You feel like all of these guys have left them and now they're eating their lunch, right? So they go crazy trying to compete with Image. DC does the same thing. The other thing is that a lot of these smaller companies formed in the last few years, like in the 80s, companies like Valiant, Malibu, see what Image is doing, and they say like, oh, we actually can compete with Marvel and DC. We don't have to be like this little indie company that's satisfied with like our little audience. We can try to be huge. Tons of other small publishers following the Image blueprint form, and now there's so many more competitors, and they're all in the comic book shops, right? It's now not just Marvel and DC, it's all this stuff, which would be great, right? But it all looks like Image. It all looks like edgy superhero comics. It's not a dozen companies all publishing different aesthetics and different themes. It's all this one thing.
Well, that's the thing, though, Brian. Of course, you talked about Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld. Of course, I know Rob Liefeld the most due to his very interesting illustration style. Absolutely. His great ability to draw feet. You know, he's not known for just having every character just be like ultra roided out muscle person with like a million pieces of body armor or whatever.
Well, no, he also draws women whose legs are like 6 feet long.
Yeah, honestly, it's one of those things where, like I said, even though I was never a big comic book fan, especially at this point, and to be fair, like I said, I've never been really a big comic book fan, but like seeing Rob Liefeld's art, especially in the modern era, it's like, I'm gonna go James Rolfe. What the fuck were they thinking? Like, it's just so bafflingly bad, honestly.
Liefeld is everything. He is the primordial, fucked up 90s artist. The dude can draw a cool monster or a cool mutant or whatever at times. Like, there was something exciting in a very adolescent way about his art. That's clearly why it struck a chord with people. But people listening, check out some Rob Liefeld art. Take a glance at the anatomy on some of those. It's buck wild. A huge, huge force in the industry. People called him the Kurt Cobain of comics at the time. Rob has his own podcast now called Robservations that I have listened to in the past. He seems fine. Actually, it's interesting. He has this reputation for being really angry and really kind of confrontational and really opinionated. But nowadays, he just seems like this chill guy that likes to talk about comic history. I have heard from other comic book fans that his art came back to comics in like the 2010s, and I guess his art's way back. That's what they say. That's what they tell me. I don't know if that's true.
You know, the thing about like 90s comics, another one that I remember is that awesome like illustration video that fucking Stan Lee and I think Todd McFarlane are doing, where they're like doing some sort of ad-lib like
so
art
good.
thing. And Stan Lee is just so passive aggressively being like, yeah, it's just awesome. It's so great. It's fantastic. You could just tell there is so much just like contempt that Stan Lee has for this, and animosity. It's awesome.
Liefeld and some of those other edgy comic guys were famous for drawing a million pouches on a character and drawing huge shoulder pads on them. Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld are inventing a new character off the dome for Stan Lee to describe the new edgy style. This is for like some comic book type TV spot, you know, for a show Stan Lee was hosting. And at one point, I think it's Liefeld says, we're going to give this guy some big old shoulder pads. And Stan Lee says, I had a feeling you would.
Honestly, rest in peace, Stan Lee, because obviously most like millennials and Zoomers know him from all his various like Marvel movie cameos or whatever. But man, he was a messy bitch a lot of times for like decades.
So, I mean, that's a whole other story. Stan Lee was messy, and there's lots of controversies about his legacy, but he was a funny fucking guy. In interviews and stuff, he was charming. There's a lot of debate in the comic book community, both with creators and fans, about what kind of a guy Stan was.
I mean, that's the thing. I know for a fact that, you know, he fucked Jack Kirby's wife and really fucked him over. I know that.
Steve Ditko as well. That's another story, but that's another thing you can look into if you're interested in comic book lore. So this whole thing with Image, the rise of the rock star cartoonist, breaking away from Marvel, forming Image, that's one big kind of, I guess, pillar of this time, right? The other thing is big events and crossovers. Now, there had been events in comics before. There had been things like Secret Wars by Marvel in the late 70s, Crisis on Infinite Earths by DC, which is both a big event, but also critically acclaimed. 91 or 93, The Death of Superman comes out. The thing with The Death of Superman is that it was a big event, and it was this big earth-shaking, like, Superman's gotten stale, we need to kind of shake people up and show him that he's not just this boring, clean-cut guy, that these stories have stakes. But something happens, and I'm not sure to what degree it was intentional and what degree it was a happy accident. People who had not read a comic book in something like 20 or 30 years find out that Superman is quote-unquote dying. People outside of the comic book community, right? It becomes like an uproar. People are appalled that they're killing Superman. All these people who, again, have never read a comic book are swarming into comic book shops. So we need to get this Death of Superman comic. Superman is dying. This is the end of an era. Now, they took a lot of care in the Death of Superman story, to be honest. They took their time with it. It's pretty tasteful. But I think most people that were regular comic book readers, they knew Superman was coming back, right? But like housewives were like, there's no more Superman after this. They sell so many of these fucking comic books.
You know what, Brian, actually speaking on this, right? And I feel like this is probably where we're going to go, but I want to put my 2 cents into this. The thing is that like that really set into motion the thing that comics have been doing forever, where they'll just be like, and I'm talking about like comic media, which I'm more familiar with comic media than I am the actual books, and like the things that are also based on comics, like video games like Mortal Kombat and stuff like that, where they'll be like, we killed a character, and then like next game or next movie or whatever the fuck, they're just back and they're like, yeah, back again. And it's like, it takes out basically any of the impact of killing a long-term character when they can just come back whenever the fuck they want to. It's like, why are we even doing this? It feels so contrived.
Well, at this point, when Superman was killed, quote unquote, death in mainstream comics was fairly permanent. Like, for instance, Marvel had done 2 major deaths, and it was Green Goblin and Gwen Stacy, who stayed dead for like 30 years. DC had done their Crisis on Infinite Earth, which killed off a bunch of classic characters for the purpose of cleaning up continuity. So within comics, death was pretty permanent, but anyone reading comics regularly knew that Superman was not being killed off, right? But what happens is it becomes this huge event series, because it's not only are we killing Superman, but this is the plan all along. We're going to have this big epic thing, and Superman is eventually going to come back. He's going to have a grand return. There's going to be this whole, across the 4 Superman titles, DC was publishing 4 titles, there's going to be a mourning period. There's going to be like, what's the world like without Superman? There's going to be a bunch of new imposter Supermen who come back, and they're all in conflict with each other, and it's a mystery about who's the real Superman, what happened to Superman's body, where did Doomsday, the creature that killed Superman, come from? It's not really that long, but it's a lot of comic books. It's basically every Superman comic book over that year touches on this, and it does incredibly well. And what the companies learn from that, they take the wrong lesson, which is maybe you should try to get some mainstream outside of the community attention. And they say, well, people like big stupid events that shake up the status quo. Now, if you do that once in a while and it's for very well thought out and it serves a purpose and maybe it says something about the character, I think that's fine. But everything after the death of Superman, everyone's going, this major superhero is boring. What can we do to make them fucked up again? So a few months after Superman comes back from the dead, Batman breaks his back. Bane breaks Batman's back. Bruce Wayne is in a wheelchair. He gets replaced by a psychopath named Azrael. Which, when you say
that was from a
sorry,
comic? I thought that was from the Dark Knight Returns.
That's from Nightfall and Night Quest.
I thought that was from Dark Knight Rises. I thought Christopher Nolan made that up, and I'm like, this is stupid. Why is this in a fucking movie?
Okay, it is stupid. Death of Superman is this huge success, and they go, we need a Death of Superman for Batman. And that's what it was. The thing with these big events is that this was a thing that frustrated me with comic books. And I read a lot of these events. So when I started buying comics, collecting comics, I inherited all of my older brother's comics. And the comics they had were from the late 80s, early 90s. So a lot of these comics from this era we're talking about were some of the first comics that I read and that I owned. But the thing with these big crossover events is they take up the whole character. Since Bruce Wayne is now in a wheelchair, there's no normal Batman stories while that's going on, by necessity. So if you just want to read a cool Batman story where Batman fights the Riddler, well, you're shit out of luck, because for the next 8 months in a wheelchair going through physical therapy, well, some psycho who's murdering people in his costume is the new Batman.
I mean, that's really fascinating that this happened in the 90s, because to me this sounds like a mid-2010s like Zoe Quinn level like comic book artist like storyline, to be honest with you.
That's the thing, is that what you're thinking about as a mid-2010s comic book story story. Like, what if this came out, but it was edgy? You know, that was the big thing in the late 2000s, early 2010s. That's all coming from this comic book era. Comic books were like a testing ground for that before everything else.
That's so fascinating to me because, like I said, the whole 2010s, like the Zoe Quinn and the Brianna Wu and that like 2015 Tumblr, like BuzzFeed social justice era where they tried to make like every character non-binary and have like Tourette's or whatever. Everything's about fucking trauma, and like Batman would be like, you know what, Joker, you have to respect my fucking pronouns or whatever. And of course, we're making fun of this sort of like bullshit comic era, but like I thought this was a thing that would come out in the mid 2010s, not something that came out in the edgy 90s. Like, it's kind of crazy to me. Like, honestly, I would have expected more of like, and I know this is a movie you're never going to see. I don't even think you saw the first one, but like Joker 2, when Joker gets gang raped in prison and you thought I was joking, I would have thought they would have did that in the fucking 90s, not in 2022 or whatever the fuck. That's crazy to me.
So you have these big events. This is another thing that sells a lot of money because these big events, they're crazy. And if you love Batman, even if you think Bruce Wayne getting his back broken is stupid, if you've been reading Batman for 20 years, you need to read it. Do you know what I mean? I know you're not a comic book fan, so you didn't grow up with him, so that might not make sense to you, but you've been reading Spider-Man for 15 years. Let me end this by talking about my favorite / least favorite of these big earth-shattering events things. There was a Spider-Man saga called the Clone Saga. It took place over 2 years and involved a total of 150 individual comic book issues to resolve this overcomplicated mess of a story. The basic premise of this story, which I will not even start to get into, is what if Peter Parker were not the real Peter Parker and he was a clone that had died? Well, the real Peter Parker had died in the 1970s.
That's 150 issues?
So, because they couldn't figure out how to end it.
What is this, a fucking DBZ storyline? That's
so
crazy.
This is a great example of why comic books became a mess in the 90s. So there were something like 5 Spider-Man titles published by Marvel. Different writers, all under one editor, but they all have different writers. All of these writers get a mandate from the editor. You need to stop what you're doing. You need to write this clone story now. And you all need to correspond with each other so that it all has continuity. And they keep writing themselves into a corner and they don't know how to end it. So it goes on and on.
This makes DBZ and Lost like sound like it not have filler. That's crazy to me. 150 issues of this storyline. That's nuts.
This is another thing that initially makes a lot of money. If you read comic books, you're used to crossovers, you're used to big events, you will follow these characters through thick and thin. But this crazy shit happens and it's exhausting to read. You have to buy all these issues. They never end. They keep forcing them at you. And for a couple of years, companies are like, oh, people love these big, stupid crossovers. The truth is that as a reader, you feel trapped by them, right? You feel kind of taken advantage of. You feel jerked around because the story's not going anywhere and it sucks. And you know at this point that whatever they do is not going to be worth it. So at this point, we've talked about questionable creative decisions, right? But now I think we should pivot on to some kind of bigger, more existential issues, which are more about the business and the culture around comics at this point. So around 1990, when you see all of these rock star titles like Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1 popping off, doing these crazy numbers, you start to see what is probably the biggest problem of all, the thing that most leads to the financial boom and the incredible crash of the market. Speculators enter comics for the first time. So previously, comic collecting was very niche. People start seeing in the 70s and 80s, the first appearance of Superman, Action Comics #1, is selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. First appearance of Batman, likewise. Spider-Man, likewise. And people who aren't into comic books, most of them came from the baseball card market, as I understand. They see these and they go, wow, these comic books are really worth money. And they start flocking to comic book shops, and any comic book that's popular in that moment, like say McFarlane's Spider-Man #1, they see that it's selling well, they see the big #1 on it, they buy it up in bulk because they're sure they're going to flip it and retire off of it, right? And people are doing this with any comic book that says #1 or that has a shiny cover. So they make the market see this huge spike, and nobody's thinking about this. Why is Action Comics #1 from 1938 so expensive? Because nobody bought it. Because people treated comic books like trash, right? Because they were pulp entertainment. So fewer of these iconic issues survived. That's why it's so valuable now. It's not because a million dumbasses ran out and bought all the copies and held on to them for 50 years, right? But no one's making this connection. Probably some of the comic book fans who actually read the books are, but none of these speculators are. So what do the companies do? They turn out variant covers. This is one of the worst trends from this time. A company will publish the same comic book and then they will have a holographic cover. They will have an alternate coloring scheme color. They'll have a gold foil cover. They'll have a gatefold cover, all for the same comic book. And the idea is that now if you're a serious collector and you want want to flip these someday and make those big bucks, you got to buy all 5 variants of Spider-Man #1. A comic book that, by the way, is not that good when you actually read it, because McFarlane can't write Spider-Man. He can only draw him. But these people don't care. You need to buy every version of this Jim Lee X-Men #1. You better buy 20 copies of Spawn #1, because that's the future of comic books. And someday you're going to sell that Spawn #1 for as much as Action Comics #1 from 1938 is selling for right now. Comic books, of course, are printing so many of these because they know that these investors are buying them all. They're not rare. It's statistically impossible for some of these comic books to be rare. Death of Superman, in my research, found multiple stories from people who worked in comic shops in the 90s where they say, yeah, my boss would buy 1,000 prints of it. He would keep a big box of them in the back. He would sell about 100, and then he would tell everyone that he ran out. And he'd mark them up by another $20 the next week and say, I got more in, but they're more expensive now.
You know what this doesn't remind me of at all, Brian? This doesn't remind me at all of various things that I've been into over the years that were once affordable hobbies for broke people that are now extremely expensive hobbies that various wealthy individuals and even wealthy individuals in fucking petro-genocide states are investing in right now. I'm talking about video games, which is something we will definitely get into on a future episode when it comes to the boom and bust of video game speculation, but holy shit, this sounds so familiar to me. Holy fuck, dude.
Well, and that's the thing is, the companies now, who are they making comics for? They're making comics for these would-be investors. So what are they incentivized to create? First of all, they're incentivized to create more new series. The reason is because you can put a big #1 on a new series. Now, you create a #1 series for who's a random fucking character from the 90s. Say Rocket Raccoon came out in 1994, and you said Rocket Raccoon #1, and everyone goes, oh, that's going to be the next Superman. I better buy that. Well, first of all, probably no, it's not. Fool Killer, that's a good 90s character that didn't take off. Fool Killer is never going to be Batman or Spider-Man or Superman. Secondly, even if he was, they printed 10,000 times more copies of his first appearance than of Batman's. Who's going to buy these in 10 or 20 years for 1,000,000 times what you paid for them? These investors, they just keep buying and sitting on it because they think that they're going to be fucking rich. And that's who the comic book companies now are publishing for. So they're incentivized to publish more #1s just so they can say #1 on the cover. They're incentivized to cover more variant covers. Like, I have some valuable comics, I still do, but my primary thing collecting comics has always been to look at them and to read them because I think it's a cool medium. It's never been an investment, but it's never even been about like, oh, look at this hermetically sealed thing that I have and I'm such a completionist. But now it's like, who's at the bottom of the totem pole for who the publishers are publishing for? People that want to read comic books. People that are going to open them up and look at the art. Doesn't matter what's in the book because no one's fucking reading it, right? Those aren't the people that are spending money now. And what happens ultimately when these investors, when these dumbasses realize that they're never going to get a return on their investment, they leave. But guess what? Now people who legitimately like comic books have also left. A lot of them have left now because by 1995, comics suck. If you're a Spider-Man fan, my brother, he's about 8 years older than me, my brothers stopped reading Spider-Man during that Clone Saga because it never ended. And I remember them telling me that they were like, yeah, it sucked. And my brother Brandon was like, yeah, I've been reading Spider-Man since I was like 6. And now it's this clone thing. And I just feel like it's never going to end. So I just stopped buying comics. Because why wouldn't you if you have any self-respect?
You know, that's the thing though, Brian. Like I said, talk about the idea of video games, right? Like, and we're going to relate this to a future episode because actually I think this might be even the next episode versus this, to be honest with you, because I think it has a very good like modern day parallel too of the modern video game like valuation bubble, but it's very similar. Talk about, once again, very rare games that exist in the 80s and 70s and even up until the 90s, right? Like games that were made for a limited run because they were made for a niche audience, but over the years had a cult following, and then eventually these games that you could buy for fucking $5 in a Goodwill bin in like 1996, and now 2020 are now worth $500 in the shittiest condition without any like manual or cover art or any fucking thing, right? And what these speculators saw, and to be fair, what video game companies saw to a slightly lesser extent because they wanted to cash in, but mostly what a lot of speculators looked in, right? Where they'd be like, ooh, here's a sequel of this game, but we're going to put limited day one edition, or we're going to do it through limited run games or whatever, and we're going to make it to where this game that you have been looking for since like the early 90s or whatever, that you've been wanting to play for fucking ever, but now it's the modern version, it's going to be just as valuable, even though they made 1 million fucking copies of this game versus like 10,000 that existed fucking prior. So now people are over investing, they're buying copies from fucking Walmart or, you know, GameStop or whatever for $60, then putting them in these like protective casings, getting them graded by these fucking bullshit companies that are now like, oh, well, I have this $60 game that's graded, so now it's worth $500 because this fucking shell company exists to basically, once again, overinflate this fucking market. So now people are thinking a $60 game that you can still buy for $60 is now worth $500 plus fucking dollars because some sham company put it in a shell and laminated it, and now they say it's worth $500 fucking dollars. So it's going the same fucking route that this comic book thing sounds like it's going from it. And to be fair, that level of like the ceiling or whatever has basically busted. Nobody gives a shit about that anymore. That's all fucking nonsense. But, you know, the games that I loved when I was a kid, or, you know, I bought from, Mega Media Exchange for $5 when I was a teenager, and now worth like $500. And they took, this thing that was made once again for like poor people to be able to play old games and basically ruined it for modern day fucking generations. So now the only way to play these games is basically to either fucking emulate them, which is technically stealing, although it really shouldn't be because they've been out of print for fucking decades.
And it's also in most cases not as good as playing the game on the original console, in my experience.
Oh, for sure. And some of those games, like famously Earthbound, actually had anti-cheat mechanisms in them, so you can't even play modded versions of those games without experiencing. And to be fair, the modded one of Earthbound literally happens on like the last 5% of the game. So you played this game for tens of hours, and now you can't even beat it because of something that was formulated 30 fucking years ago by a greedy, shitty company like Nintendo. It's fucking hilarious. Sucks.
It's crazy. They had it fucking down.
And you know what? Even one more thing about the Earthbound thing real quick, though, is that, like, you know, even the thing where Nintendo came out years later for an official version of these games, you can play the Super NES Classic, even that got bought up by scalpers. So now you can't even get that for less than a few $100s. So even the more recent legal way to play Earthbound, you can't even get for an affordable fucking price anymore. It's fucking bullshit. It's wild.
You would think, right, that people would learn, but they don't, because the people that are doing this with video games, they aren't looking back at the comic book. Well, they're like, well, those are completely different industries. I guess you should never be surprised by how dumb, greedy people are willing to come in and ruin a hobby that they don't give a shit about. And you should never be surprised by the companies who produce that merchandise that sustains the hobby's willingness to acquiesce to those people as opposed to people who actually love the art form. We shouldn't be surprised by that. But somehow I think you always are a little bit. You'd like to think that your hobbies have a little bit more integrity and a little more creativity than that, right? You know, we all like to think that, I think, and it sucks to see that happen to it.
No, I agree. And like the thing on top of it though too is that you talk about the comic book thing, right? And how comic books leaned into the speculator and fucking like scalper market and stuff like that. But it seems like companies are more reticent to do that now more than ever. And it's so fucking shitty. Like the whole like Pokemon thing or whatever. Like now Pokemon cards are like the new like mass speculator thing among nerds at this point or whatever. Right. And like retailers and Nintendo are doing nothing to quell that. So they're taking this thing that of course they're making a shit ton of money on it. So of course they have no incentive not to do it. But they're taking their fucking integrity away for a company that Nintendo is already fucking scummy in the first place. Their fucking reputation's in the toilet at this point. But they keep doing more shit to ruin their fucking reputation. It's wild.
Here's the thing that a company like Nintendo and something, in my opinion, like Pokemon cards, which is a little niche, but it's, you know, Pokemon is pretty big and it's gonna kind of stick through and it's owned by Nintendo. Here's a benefit that has that something like comic books didn't, is that comic books have been kept alive since the 1940s by dedicated people who love that art form and who will go and buy it every week or every month. That's what keeps it going to this day, even though it's in a really bad shape as a market. So when comic book publishers decide that the money is not with those people, and I'm not saying this as some like, they don't care about the fans, like idealist way. I mean it as a practical business decision. When they decide to ignore those people for these speculators, they are now alienating. Like Nintendo doesn't survive, because it's such a big company at this point, off of people that love Nintendo as like this thing that they grew up with. It survives off of being fucking huge, right? Comic books don't have that. The only time they had that was during the speculator boom. The other thing is that during this boom, which again, I can't overstate, this is the most financially profitable that comic books have ever been. They will never approach this level ever again, and they had never approached it before. Because of this, you see a lot more comic book shops. Now, I had talked about how through the 70s and 80s into the 90s, the direct market comic book store became the primary way of buying comics pretty gradually. And it's a pretty good business model early on, because some of these guys are pretty serious nerds, and they had a whole business plan for, hey, I could actually have a comic book store. They really thought about it, a lot of them. During the comic book boom, in my opinion, this is based on some of the comic book stores that I was going to in the very late 90s, which would have been stores that were probably just destitute if they survived the comic book boom of the 90s. You know, in retrospect, I can think about my favorite comic book store at the time, which closed in the early 2000s, and I can recognize that it was a dying store. I think a lot of these guys, a lot of these comic book fans who maybe graduated high school, they loved comic books, maybe they're even kind of bright, you know, they're like, wow, people make a lot of money off of my dumb hobby that everyone said was never going to be worth anything. I should start a comic book store. But if 1 out of every 10 comic book nerds is saying that, how many comic book stores are there? Instead of one comic book store or maybe 2 comic book stores in a major city. For a while in the early 90s, I looked it up, Taylor. There was something like 4 in Green Bay in this period.
Wow. One of them was, I think, my local comic book store. And like, because my neighborhood growing up had like basically no fucking businesses and it was entirely residential. And I think one of the few businesses was the comic book store, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, there was a comic book store I went to. I grew up about an hour and a half outside of Green Bay, but we'd travel there for doctor's appointments. My mom would take me to this dingy comic book store that had a real cool selection. And the guy that owned it was real nice. And he was a kind of an awkward guy, but he would always recommend cool stuff to me and he'd give me deals on collectibles. And then one day I started going to his store and I noticed there was a big padlock on the door, probably in like 2009 or so, right? So that was the end of that. But that was in retrospect a rough store. So there was that place and there was Powers, which I did check today does still exist in Ashwaubenon. There were 2 other comic book stores at least that I can find in the early 90s. That's in Green Bay. Think about how many comic book stores were in a suburb of Chicago at this point. How long can that many comic stores be sustainable? How long can they turn a profit? Also, how different can one comic book store be from another that's a block away from it?
No, exactly. How many comic book guys from fucking The Simpsons could there be that are running
and they all
these stores?
Look like that. No offense to any of you guys, but you all look like that.
They kind of do. And you know what? Yeah, no shade. We're not body shaming on this podcast. We might body shame
it just is what it is.
but we are not body shaming on this podcast. But yeah, they kind of do. I'm just going to be honest. They kind of fucking do. They might not even be that big, but they all have ponytails. They all have ponytails.
My guy at the comic book shop I was just talking about that I went to in like East Green Bay, this tiny dingy comic book shop, he looked like a skinny comic book guy. So my point ultimately is take all these things together. First of all, you've got, let's be honest, not the best stories, not the best art. And a lot of longtime fans are getting burnt out. You've got all these speculators in who, first of all, are racking up the prices. They're buying every garbage comic book with a gold foil cover. They're buying 20 copies of it. There's no copies of it in normal Spider-Man comic left for maybe just a kid that wants to read it because these weirdos thinking that they're going to turn into fucking trillionaires off it, so they're buying them all up. They're also unpleasant and they don't really like comic books and they're filling up the comic book shops. There's comic book shop every corner, every block of your town, probably in every suburb of your town if you live in a mid-sized city at this point, right? It has its own comic book shop. They're filled with these people, these speculators who are jacking up the prices, who don't really like comic books. All the stories suck. There's a million different publishers and they all kind of look the same. Like, what's the end of this? What's the sustainable part of this? There was none. But at the same time, comic books had nothing else because this industry have always been pretty volatile. They've always had pretty severe ups and downs because of changes in the culture, changes in industry, all of these things. The thing that's kept them alive, like I said, is that it's an art form that people that are into really love and they'll keep coming back to and they'll keep spending their hard-earned money on it. But at this point, the comic book companies are making money. They don't want to stop doing what's making them money. And I don't even know to what degree they see that it's alienating the fan base and that it's kind of destroying the infrastructure of the industry. I have read some interviews where some of the lower level people in the companies, like writers and artists, say, like, I could see that this wasn't good, but like their editors and the people on top of their editors, the people that own the parent companies, certainly aren't seeing that or don't care.
That's the thing real quick about the speculator market, right? Is that like, you know, a lot of people on the lower end or whatever heard about it and they thought about it as a way to like make quick money or whatever. Like, yeah, we're going to make these, or we're going to find these #1 issue comics, we're going to get rich off of it or whatever. But like, if your average like fucking comic book nerd in Green Bay, Wisconsin is hearing about it, you already lost. Like, you are on the down trend of who's ever making money from this. So like, if you're hearing about it for the first time, 1994 Green Bay or whatever, you're not going to make any money off this. There's no speculation you could possibly win on this. It's a pyramid scheme, basically. Like, all speculation is pyramid scheme shit. Like, straight up, you are not making any fucking money off this. So the best way to get into it is just enjoy it while you can, but don't think you're going to make any money on it because you're certainly not going to.
And where does this end up? Well, exactly where you'd think. By the mid-90s, all these speculators, they realize none of these comics are going to be the next Action Comics #1. Guess what? No comic book will ever be Action Comics #1 again because it was published in 1938 and it's the first appearance of Superman. And anyone that was a fan of comic books and was into the history knows that. But these speculators, these baseball card guys, these guys who maybe if they're real lucky got into crypto 20 years later, they don't know that. They just think, oh, a comic book is a comic book. It's all the same to me because I don't give a shit about it, so they must all be the same. All these guys leave. And a lot of the regular readers have left because the stories suck and they kind of feel pushed out, right? A lot of the people that are going to the comic book stores who have, so one of the coolest innovations of the comic book shop really quick, and I have at points in my life had these, although not in a long time, is that you can have a subscription through your comic book shop instead of through the mail. Because when you get a comic book in the mail, it's oftentimes damaged. You know, parcel carriers don't know how to package a fucking floppy comic book, but you get a little mailbox at your comic book shop and they take a list of all your monthly titles and then they set it aside for you and they always put it in your mailbox. And you don't have to pay for it until you get there. You go to the comic shop, you pick up your books in your mailbox, you pay cover price, and if you have a really cool comic book store owner, maybe they'll put some extra things that they think you might like because they know your taste in your mailbox to show you. And if you don't buy them, you don't. And if you do, you do. But if those people aren't coming to the comic book shops and the speculators are gone, nobody's in there. And by the mid-90s, that's where we're at. By the mid-90s, I think in 1997, Marvel files for bankruptcy. By 1995, a couple years before that, basically every comic book story coming out is a crossover. And why? Because crossovers always make money. So there's a Spawn Batman crossover. There's Spider-Man versus Batman. Because these are big characters and that's going to make money, right? They know that that's going to make money. Marvel versus DC, one of the worst comic book stories I've ever read, happens where their two universes fight each other. The only reason that happened because both Marvel and DC were burnt out and they needed to make some quick cash and they knew that would make money.
I think this is what you're leading to this, but I just want to guess real quick. This is what led directly to Marvel selling off a bunch of IPs for pennies on the dollar to these movie studios and basically a lot of those movies getting made, essentially, right?
Yeah. Marvel was about to die in the mid-late 90s, was about to stop existing. Yeah, they sold almost all of their IPs to film studios for pennies on the dollar to survive. That's the brilliance of the Avengers franchise, of Guardians of the Galaxy, of all that shit, right? Is that Sony gets the big names. It gets Spider-Man and it gets X-Men. And I guess they also got Daredevil, who's not as big a name, but that is one that Sony and Fox got.
I'm pretty sure X-Men was Fox.
It was Fox. You're right. You are right. But that other company that we now have to see for the rest of our lives, they get the Avengers. They get Iron Man. They get Captain America. Nobody gives a shit about, right? People know who they are. They're famous, iconic characters, but nobody cares, right? But eventually they make these massive movies out of them. The thing is, that doesn't help Marvel as a comic book company. It does a little bit. I shouldn't say it doesn't, but it doesn't the way that it should. For as iconic as the Avengers are right now, shouldn't every kid be reading comic books? Well, partially that'll never happen because times have changed, media's changed. Part of it just is a failure to market on the point of the comic book companies, right? Because they're so used to marketing to these grown-up fans who just are set in their ways. They don't know how to market to kids anymore. By the late 90s, the very late 90s, the early 2000s, which is coincidentally the same point where I'm buying my own comic books, my poor mom burnt a lot of money on comic books for me. And my mom didn't have a ton of disposable income, but I was kind of a weird, sad, quiet kid. And I think my mom would just, if she saw something I was really excited in, like how I was excited in comic books, like she was gonna try to find a way to get it to me. And that was kind of an early bonding experience for me and my mom, was we would track down comic books. She would take me to this dingy comic book store in Green Bay, and this guy would help me find all the Spider-Man issues that I was trying to collect. This is like when I'm 8, 9, right? But around this time, luck would have it that the companies, they now have no money. So they have no need to continue doing these gatefolds. And what you see a lot of them doing is, I now notice in retrospect, although I didn't realize it at the time because I was so young, they're kind of getting back to basics, right? And that ends up in the very early 2000s with this series of lines that are like core Spider-Man lines, core X-Men lines, where they kind of strip down the characters, they take them back to like their kind of 70s roots, where like, this is Peter Parker, he's a troubled guy that's trying to help his wife and his aunt, and he also, has money problems, but he wants to fight superheroes. And, the X-Men are like hated by society, but they still try to protect him. Marvel is kind of smart enough to get back to those core components while still doing some weird stuff, some crazy stuff, some kind of edgy stuff, because that's just the way the market's trended. And that becomes the blueprint for these first big movies. But the comic industry, it never recovers from this. How could it? First of all, it's never going to reach those heights again that it reached in the early 90s, right? But it's never even going to come close because the industry is kind of damaged by that. So I follow what's going on in like comic book retailers relatively closely because I think it's interesting. I want the industry to do well. I think comic books are the great American art form. They're never going to disappear, but the comic book shop as we knew it throughout the 70s and 80s and especially the 90s might stop existing. As far as a thing that's in every city, it's probably going to stop existing like that. And it's because they're in this spot where they can't really grow their business. They can't really capitalize on all of this fame and iconography of the MCU movies or the fucking Joker movies or whatever. They can't do anything else, right? You and I were talking about this. There's two types of comic book shops across the country from the research I did over the last week, which a lot of message boards, a lot of people watched some videos. I tried to like get things from people in other parts of the country, their current comic book store experience. And what I saw, Taylor, was, and you had made the same prediction, a lot of comic book stores that still survive, they sell some comic books, but they sell a lot of action figures, they sell a lot of Magic the Gathering cards, they sell Warhammer shit, and they sell Funko Pops and stuff like that. Kind of sad, makes sense, similar to a lot of video game stores. The thing that I think is even crazier, and I can't even blame these surviving comic book stores store owners for this, is that it appears from the research I've done, there are surviving comic book stores around the country that only sell back issues. They literally just sell the owner's personal collection. They don't order any new comic books from the publishers, and they're kind of just coasting off doing that until they either need to close the store or just sell all of their inventory, right? Now, if you want to do that and you can afford to do that, that's cool. Like, I love back issues. I don't buy any new Spider-Man comics. I haven't for 15 years, but I buy Spider-Man back issues every single time I go into a comic book shop, you know? But if you're trying to say, like, make comic book retailers a thriving industry, then only selling your personal collection of back issues is not the way to do it, especially because another anecdotal thing that I read from multiple people is they say, my local comic book shop only sells back issues, and since it's the owner's personal collection, he sells them for, like, exorbitant prices. I think because he doesn't want to really get rid of them. And I saw multiple people around the country saying that.
No, absolutely. And, you know, it's one of those things where I think this is a very interesting topic, Brian, but we've been recording for about 13 hours. We are getting very old and we do need to go to bed soon. So, Brian, do we have any final thoughts?
You know, I have one final thought for you. First of all, if you're into comic book shit, whether it's alternative comic books, whether it's superhero shit, see if your town, if your city has a comic book shop and go in and check it out. And my personal philosophy with a comic book store, like a record store, go in there and find something cheap to buy. Just buy something. I mean, if it's a thing you're into, if you're into records or you're into comic books, get something cheap. Just try to be part of that community and try to keep them around, because in my opinion, it's important to have brick and mortar stores like that exist. If you want an example of a crazy, ridiculous, kind of gimmicky 90s comic book story that's also pretty entertaining and pretty well written, I would say try reading The Death of Superman story. It's a short, slim volume graphic novel by Dan Jurgens. It's one of the pillars of all this bullshit. It's what set off all the chaos, but it's also pretty entertaining. So it gives you a good example of all the bad elements of 90s comics, but it's also not a bad read.
No, absolutely. And, you know, my final thoughts is, as I've related to my experiences in the speculator market and my general very light knowledge of this topic in general, but like, you know, any speculator market, anything that, you know, nerds online are trying to hype you about when it comes to media, or like not even nerds, like just other speculators and scalpers when it comes to other products like fucking, you know, Beanie Babies or Labubu's or, you know, those fucking stupid cups that existed. But like either way, whatever. Like if somebody's trying to hype you up on something that's like, oh, you better invest now because like you never fucking know what it's going to be worth 20 years from now. Those people are all liars. Those people are all fucking liars outside of maybe Bitcoin. But even then, that's a market that's only being hoarded by fucking tech pedophiles. So who gives a shit what they fucking think?
I mean, it was made for them.
No, absolutely. I mean, literally, what was Bitcoin first used to buy online? It was cheese pizza, both the Pizza Hut and Domino's variety and the illegal kind. That's what fucking Bitcoin was set up to buy originally. And to be fair, drugs. But like any speculator market, like I said, it's one of those things where it's like, it's always a fucking scam. If it's something you already enjoy, just enjoy it, like I said, for the hobby of it. You know, you can certainly, if you want to overpay for certain things, you're certainly more than fucking welcome to. But like I said, if it's not something that you already have copies of or invested in well before it became the speculator bubble, it is guaranteed to be fucking worthless. It just is. So just know what the hell you're getting into. But if you want to enjoy it, if you want to still support your local brick and mortar stores, like of course, when it comes to other media, you know, Mega Media Exchange in Wisconsin, or, you know, Pre-Played in Green Bay, or, you know, fucking Game Trade in, you know, the Green Bay suburbs once again, or Gaming Generation, whatever the fuck, right? Like if there's a brick and mortar local store you want to support, feel free to. But like I said, do not think the speculator market will do anything to help you financially. And the businesses that are currently doing it right now, at best, it will basically ruin your reputation as a business, or at worst, like it did with Marvel, it will basically almost completely destroy your business. And the only reason it survived was because of the other money-grubbing companies that took your IP and made it into something successful.
Picked the bones from Marvel's IP, yeah. I would say just a rule of thumb is, if you think something is cool and you want to buy it for a reasonable price, buy it for that reason. If you want to buy a record or a comic book or an action figure or a video game, buy it because you like it and you'll enjoy having it. And then maybe somewhere down the line you want to sell it, and maybe you can sell it for more than you paid for it. That'd be cool. But these are not the types of products to hitch your wagon to try to like plan your retirement for. And that's fine. We love ephemera here. That's literally what podcasts are. This is a podcast about ephemera. But get it because you like it and spend an amount of money that you're comfortable with, not because you think that it's going to change your life or set your future, because that's just not going to happen.
No, absolutely. And with all of our final thoughts out of the way, and this is going to be at least a part 2, like I said, about my feelings about the speculator market on video games and movies, which I've only really scratched the surface of. So next episode, we will definitely delve into that. But at least for right now, that is our episode on the 90s comic book boom boom and bust cycle and what it led to. So let's get into our pluggable, shall we? So you can follow me at Carlos Shantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe to us and follow us on both our our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, our good friends Scott, Shaw, and Robert are creating a fantastic series. We interviewed them well over a month ago at this point, and they're continuing to work on the show. I believe they're currently right now in post-production, but they need some more financial support and also, to be fair, spiritual support, but at this point, primarily financial support to continue to get future episodes of Lucifer and the Father and the ones that they've already finished off the ground. So feel free to donate to those today, because they have been cool dudes to us and they deserve our support.
They're hard at work. I know we talk about it a lot. We've done that whole episode, but I think if you are on the fence about donating to them, you should listen to that episode. They had some really good thoughts. In general, being an independent filmmaker, I think, faith-based or not, I think, again, if you're not sure if that's something you want to donate to, you should try listening to our interview, because they are really cool guys. And I think that really comes through, especially in our latest interview with them.
No, absolutely. And of course, our promise to you is always that if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, send us any proof that you donated, and we will, within good reason, about $20-25 match those donations, because of course we want Scott, Shaw, and Robert's dreams to become even more of a reality than they already are. And speaking of people whose dreams we want to become a reality, dreams of freedom, we of course have been plugging the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund for quite a while. We believe in our boy Luigi. The current update as of today, as of recording, is that he is still currently fighting the fruit of the poison tree argument that the prosecution are trying to fucking pin him on, where that bullshit evidence that was gathered at the Altoona arrest. Of course, Luigi's defense team are trying to, strike that from the record, because of course that evidence is dubious at best. Of course, we don't believe Luigi did it at all. We believe Luigi's innocent. And the fact that the police mishandled the initial arrest, and to be fair, pretty much every subsequent development of the prosecution afterwards, they've screwed it up. We want Luigi to have the best possible trial, and giving him his, legal defense, our solidarity, basically anything we can do for him is helping him and other people who are also being screwed over by the criminal justice system in the long run a fighting chance. Because, once again, Luigi is fighting two different state governments and the federal government, and even though he's innocent, it's still an uphill battle for him. So we need to give him our moral and financial support to the best of our abilities. He's a cool ass dude, and just like everybody else who's currently being fucked over by our criminal justice system, and people who are literally being extrajudicially murdered in the street, as always happens in America, but seems to be a lot more at this point fairly recently. We need to stand up for those people. Very because cool. Divided we fall, united we stand. Straight up.
Yeah, again, Luigi's team they're hard at work, and they seem to have made some really serious progress recently, again, as of recording. But I do think a lot of that is obviously first and foremost because of the hard work that they're putting in, because of the great team that they've got, and all of the people that have shown solidarity to Luigi at this point. But I also think if we all continue to show that solidarity, we all continue to donate, or even just to talk about him, to raise awareness about him, and to show support to him, and to make the powers that be aware that we all support him, we have a better chance of them winning those concessions. The more eyes that are on, the more pressure is on. That also means that there's more pressure on them to get Luigi, which again, he is absolutely not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But I don't know what else you can say at this point. I mean, if you are not on the train for Luigi Mangione, or anyone that is being railroaded, deported, or murdered by police or, federal agents in this country right now, I don't know what to say to you about it. This is not good. And I think supporting Luigi, he is someone who, because of the situation that he's in, because of the level of support he's gotten, he has a chance to get a fair shake out of this. There are people fighting to give him a fair shake, and we should all want to be among those people that are helping him to get that. We should help anyone that is in a position like that, who's getting fucked over by this fucking country or this administration or whatever you want to say. We should be helping anyone who's being targeted by them to, again, get that fair shake, because if we don't, they're not going to get it.
No, absolutely. And as always, of course, like we said with the Lucifer and the Father campaign, just send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just show us any proof that you donated, and we will, within good reason, match those donations, because of course we said we want Luigi to have the best possible trial. And speaking of people who have went through trials and tribulations over the years, of course, this podcast, we have our very own Patreon. Now, of course,
it's been hard for us. We've come a long way.
It really has. And speaking of, we don't have any supporters on our Patreon as of this current moment, but be our first one today. Of course, we have many great tiers on the Patreon. The best tier, in my opinion, is the $5 tier, where you get every episode up to 48 hours early, because we always say the first 48 hours are the most important. Because, if you want to talk to your normie coworkers who just love Marvel slop these days, and explain to them why Marvel sucks these days, and it's the 90s comic book boom and bust cycle, you can explain to them why that happens, and then you can talk to your normie coworker, and they'll just be like, yeah, that's awesome. Hey, have you ever heard of this guy named Kill Carl? And you'll be like, yeah, I love him. He's awesome. He would love this episode of this podcast too.
We're going to give you lots of information. First of all, we're giving you lots of information about the speculator market, about the reseller market. Imagine if you had heard this episode 2 weeks earlier or whatever. Imagine if you'd heard that 48 hours earlier. You could run into your local comic book shop. You could make all the hot speculation moves. You could buy the new hot issue of Squirrel Girl or Paper Houses or whatever is popular right now. And then you could flip it for like $5,000 in 3 months, because that's how the industry works.
No, absolutely. Like that, Harley Quinn fart comic that guy on YouTube who had a fart fetish about Harley Quinn wrote, apparently. Did you ever see that clip,
not
Brian?
Fetish. It wasn't a fetish comic.
That guy wrote that comic, I'm 90% sure, or at least he came immediately when he heard the fucking, the news article about it.
He was writing a bunch of letters to DC's editors, under different names to make them think there was a huge audience for that.
The amazing state of the comic book industry. But either way, yes, absolutely. You will hear all these things on our Patreon, so become our first patron today. And Brian, do you have any pluggables as well?
Yeah, as always, follow us at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. That remains the best way to reach out to me for the show. If you would like to criticize us, if you'd like to make recommendations, if you hate my guts, if you'd like to gamergate me, Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. You can also follow me at JLo Biafra on Instagram and Threads as well. You should really just follow the Millennials Are Old Pod one. You can also follow us at just Facebook page Millennials Are Old. I gotta maybe stir up the pot with the Tom Laughlin group, because they're kind of dead silent. Mostly now it is just Tom's nephew posting just based lib stuff that doesn't really have anything to do with Tom. Pretty cool. I'm glad he's doing it, but I'd like to see some based lib versus Chud Billy Jack fan Tom Laughlin debates, so maybe I should get back in there and stir up some shit.
Can't wait to hear more about that. But speaking of things I can't wait to hear more about, Brian, I can't wait to hear more about my snoring, because I've been told I snore while I sleep, which is what I'm going to be doing after this episode, because we're both old-ass millennials. We're getting more tired. We're getting more haggard. We're becoming more chopped and washed and unk every day. Would you agree with that, Brian?
I'm so unk. I work with two Zoomers right now. They'll say something and I'll reply and I'll be like, I'm being unk right now.
No, absolutely. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight, and we'll come back with a great episode for you next time, as always.